Hi there, welcome to our spiritual power inventory. This is a workshop intended for energy workers, emotional holders, and spiritual leaders. My name is Kayla Felten, and I am a licensed independent clinical social worker here in the Twin Cities, and I'm also one of the co-founders of the Reclamation Collective.
Hello, I'm joining Kayla today, and I am a Twin Cities-based massage therapist and yoga teacher.
So, Sophia and I have had a really awesome opportunity the last probably 6 to 9 months, somewhere in there, of creating and holding space for some spiritual abuse support groups, specifically for women. And so, as a result of doing that work together for the last few months, we've had a lot of opportunity to sit with kind of what are some of the risk factors, what are some of the dynamics that come into play that in many cases sometimes all parties in a relationship, at least one party or all parties, might not be conscious of. And so our intention of holding space for this workshop is really to generate some reflection and some kind of consciousness raising, specifically for people who may find themselves in positions of leadership, who may have power, and how can we keep communities safe when we know about what power, particularly spiritual power, we're holding. So do you want to just kind of go through what are we offering today?
So we'll start out this time together with a grounding exercise, and then after that we're going to move through some definitions of what spiritual abuse is, what it might look like, and then start to build some language around this topic. And towards the end of our time together, we're going to offer some reflective questions. So we'll encourage you to have a notebook handy so that you can take notes and take some time afterward to go through. And then we'll finish with the grounding exercise again. So we'll start out with your feet resting flat onto the floor, your hands into your lap wherever they feel comfortable. Just taking these first few moments so that we can start to move into awareness of our nervous systems, and we'll do so by coming into contact with our breath. Noticing without changing anything how your breath is moving through the body. Any areas of tightness, tension, holding, physically, mentally, emotionally. And seeing if, as we start to consciously deepen the breath, we might start to open up some of that space so that we can come into this time with receptivity. So starting to feel your inhale drop all the way down toward your belly. Feel your exhale wash down the shoulders, down the body, and out the soles of the feet. And continuing with that breath awareness, inhale expanding into your belly. Exhale washing down the body and out the soles of your feet. And taking that a few more times. Maybe letting the breath deepen with each repetition. Allowing the heart rate to start to slow. And last couple breaths here. And if the eyes have been closed, you can allow them to be open and bringing yourself back into the space.
Thanks, Sophia.
Yeah.
So the intention or the initial inspiration for holding space for a workshop like this is really just to acknowledge and validate that there is a high prevalence of spiritual abuse that takes place in all kinds of communities, both religious and non-religious communities. And so that's one piece that I think that Sophia and I have really been exploring is how do we define and talk about spiritual power when many folks aren't really even sure what qualifies, I suppose, as like a spiritual space or a spiritual context. And so we're hopeful that folks kind of sitting with this concept and sitting with this language that we're building together will be able to take inventory of where in their relationships and in their power dynamics at play, where might there be room for spiritual abuse? So first of all, I just want to kind of define when we use the phrase spiritual abuse in this workshop, we're going to be referring to the conscious or unconscious use of power to direct, control, or manipulate another's body, thoughts, emotions, actions, or capacity for choice, freedom, or autonomy of self. And this, like I said, can happen within a spiritual or religious context. So I feel like once we define kind of what spiritual abuse is, then we also have to kind of talk about what is a spiritual context. Because I do know that I've learned with a lot of the space that I hold is specifically around religious trauma. And so I think sometimes when people hear that phrase spiritual, they it's easy to kind of associate it with religion or within like religious context. And I would, a definition that I'm really vibing with is spiritual context is just any context that relates to or affects the human spirit or soul. This is not pertaining to like physical or material things. This is really about how do I identify my purpose? How do I identify kind of what I should do? So spaces that I might typically go to for guidance, for emotional holding, for support, those are going to be some relationships that have a spiritual power or a spiritual context to them.
Kayla and I both grew up in religious contexts, but both of us have started to explore more, I guess, New Age spiritual contexts. And so this can be yoga communities, this can be
sacred medicine communities, this can be other really communities where people are having a strong sense of kind of interdependence on other people within that community. So what we might traditionally think of as a cult can also just be a culture of that interdependence. And a commune can also just be a community of that interdependence. And so there's, And I think that another piece to why we're really wanting to identify all of the places outside of religious context where spiritual abuse can still happen is because I have found in my work that especially those, honestly, like Sofia and I, who've experienced religious trauma, when you maybe leave that context, the narrative you might tell yourself is, well, now I'm safe. I'm not in that context anymore, which honestly has left me for sure very vulnerable to recreating my trauma in other contexts. I wasn't looking for these spiritual power dynamics because the narrative I told myself for most of my life was that only exists in a religious context, which unfortunately left me and many of the folks who we've gotten to cross paths with over the last year of holding space around this topic. It seems like a lot of folks who've had religious trauma really might not be in tune with where they could be recreating those same power dynamics in other contexts. So, so it seems like the existence of spiritual abuse also implies this existence of spiritual power. And so I often use for me, spiritual power, I often use almost hand in hand with the concept of trust. So anyone who I have projected trust onto or who I have trust with, there's a spiritual power dynamic in which I have, at least internally, I may not have communicated them, but I have a set of expectations and for how I expect to be treated by that person because I'm trusting that they have my best interest in mind. That also might mean that I'm trusting that they know me really intimately, whether or not they do. That they might know how I want to be treated and what makes me feel violated or safe and what doesn't. So we're going to be kind of just talking through, just kind of how do we identify spiritual power and where we hold spiritual influence. So sometimes spiritual power is granted to an individual based on their occupation or title. This would be, for example, a therapist, a pastor, a faith leader, a clergy member, a guru, a community leader, where it's kind of like in their title. So I think that sometimes it's almost easier perhaps to kind of do inventory for power dynamics with folks who have kind of a a title, it's within their role, it's within their occupation. So I, for example, as a therapist, I do have to take inventory for the amount of spiritual power that I may hold with my clients. And so also with my role as a support group facilitator, also my role as the co-founder of the collective and kind of generating a platform on our social media where I'm talking and trying to provide different versions and forms of psychoeducation for a community that probably has not often felt represented or heard, and certainly probably has not received a ton of guidance. And so I have to be really conscious that people might be putting me in the position to offer guidance where I'm really not offering it. And so I think that as an occupational emotional holder, as someone who has a couple of letters at the end of my name, people might hear that, and whether or not they're my client, they may project some trust onto me. Just knowing that I'm a therapist, they might say, well, then you must be a trustworthy caregiver and leader and guide. And so I have to be very conscious of that means that even if someone's not my client, I may still hold spiritual power in that dynamic should they trust me. Which also means I have to be very aware of my boundaries and my ethics and how I communicate boundaries in relationship with people. I also think that as an occupational emotional holder, there is a system of accountability for therapists. Being a licensed therapist, I should actually say that. If you're a licensed therapist, there is a system of accountability in terms of there's a licensing board that should I or any licensed therapist ever cross a boundary with a client, leaving a client feeling violated, manipulated, or abused, there is a licensing board that they can pursue justice with. My license could be investigated, and whether or not I could be trusted in the future with clients could be put into question. I know that there's an informed consent at the beginning of my relationship with clients. They know what my code of ethics is, they know what my licensing board is, and they are informed of how they can report to that, which then allows for there to be a little bit more of like naming where the power lies. Yes, this is a power dynamic that a client may be entering, and also there's power in that they have a place to report should they feel uncomfortable. So it's also naming where clients, the people who interact with me in that professional realm, where they have power and they have a pathway to being heard, should they not feel heard in our relationship. So I think it's important to differentiate between like an occupational emotional holder, perhaps a person who has this as part of their role. So I think that sometimes, pastors, sometimes community leaders, even though it's part of their title or their role, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a license or a system of accountability in place. And so those are just some pieces that I think if it's a part of your title, I do think there needs to be some awareness and reflection on like what does that communicate when someone finds out your occupation or your title. And if that is an occupation or title that generally elicits trust, then you do probably have a lot of power dynamics that you're surrounded by, whether or not you're aware of them.
Where things get a little more nebulous is when we start to move into the more new age or energy world. And these people can be maybe just somebody that's well respected within a community. So they may not have a formal title, but they may have kind of been around and people start to kind of gravitate around them. And this might be because they're seen as somebody that has a lot of spiritual knowledge or a lot of experience within these more energetic spiritual realms. So again, this is informal, but people see them as kind of up on a pedestal. Or somebody like an energy worker, body worker. I have both students and bodywork clients coming to me with this notion of, oh good, you're here to heal me. And that is a very precarious position to be put in because you could either be like, yep, that's my job, I'm going to heal you. And that can be really damaging in a lot of ways because you're taking that power away from the person and giving it all to yourself because all of a sudden you hold something that they can't provide for themselves. So I consider my job ultimately to be to offer people the awareness and the personal practices so that they can embrace their own personal power. So that's a consideration for anybody that might be a non-occupational emotional holder. There are, specifically for, let's say, a yoga teacher, there is a board through the Yoga Alliance that you can report misconduct through. But if it is more within these communities, then there's really nothing holding people accountable.
Really, I think ultimately it comes down to it's all of our own responsibility and opportunity. We all have the opportunity to reflect on who are we giving trust and power and influence to in our lives? Who are we seeking guidance and emotional holding from? And then also who's coming to us and seeking that emotional holding, that guidance from us. And so I think that when we're able to name those dynamics, then we're able to put words to boundaries, put words to expectations, and then also name when something doesn't feel good, doesn't feel, there's room for intuition, right? You're inviting that person's intuition into the conversation when we name that there's a power dynamic at play. I also want to just name that when we do this inventory work, I think sometimes it's easy to get into like the shame cycle again of, oh, well, I've projected all this power onto this person, or wow, I'm really vulnerable because all these people have power over me. And I just want to kind of name that I think spiritual power dynamics just are. I don't think they're on this, binary of good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. I think that they just are. And in many cases, I'm so thankful for some of those dynamics that have guided me and emotionally held me really, really well in ways that have made me feel really safe. And I've had a lot of spiritual power dynamics and relationships that have left me feeling really empowered and really seen and, like we said, just held. So certainly when we go through this inventory, when folks are kind of saying, where do I have spiritual power, that doesn't necessarily need to be something that you harvest guilt over. And yet it's an opportunity to be able to name where those dynamics are at play so you can protect others and you can set up boundaries and protections for yourself too. I think we can also name when emotional holders and energy workers and community or religious or spiritual leaders have earned our trust. And I think you can earn trust and maintain it using healthy boundaries, conscious communication, and then also considerations for consent. So those are going to be kind of the three guiding themes kind of for this conversation. But we're actually going to transition into the writing and reflective part of this workshop, which is where we're actually going to take inventory. So we're just going to go ahead and go through the inventory questions, and so make sure that you're just kind of writing down the questions, and then after this workshop we would encourage you to kind of sit with each one and journal it out or just consider where you stand with all of these questions. So the first inventory question: who are the communities or individual relationships in which you hold spiritual power?
Second question: if any individuals within those communities were to interact with you in a way that felt violating, manipulative, or abusive, would there be a way for them to get out of that relationship?
Third question: would there be a system of accountability for that person to report the hypothetical abuse?
Fourth question: what kind of boundaries are in place to respect the autonomy and safety of the individuals who you hold spiritual power with?
Reflecting back, have there been times where you may have misused your spiritual power through inappropriate behavior or conduct?
And our last inventory question is: where does your spiritual support begin and end? Meaning, whether this is a class, a training session, a ceremony, a therapy session, are you communicating clearly that at the end of this time together, this is where my support ends? Are you giving personal contact information and saying that they can reach you at any time? So just being sure if you have or have not been clear about these expectations. And along with that, are you offering alternative resources for people? Because let's say you're in a really intense session, whatever it might be, maybe some trauma comes up, maybe really strong emotions come up, and either you don't have the expertise or licensure to address it. Do you have the willingness to offer alternative resources so that this person can have these needs addressed?
So I want to just kind of unpack all of those questions for a moment, and just give some kind of possible answers, I guess. So the first question we had in the inventory is, who are the communities or individual relationships in which you hold spiritual power? So certainly if you're an occupational emotional holder, part of your role or title has to do with emotional holding, guiding, supporting folks, then certainly be aware of who are your clients, who are your congregants, who are your patients. And certainly if you're not in that context where it's not necessarily part of your title, role, licensure, etc., then who are folks that are coming to you for guidance, or who are trusting you with their sacred stories or courageous vulnerability? Who are the people that are coming to you seeking that emotional holding or guidance? Yeah. The second question is about if folks were to interact with you in a way that felt violating, manipulative, or abusive, would there be a way for them to get out of that relationship?
So within this context, we can consider that there is an individual therapy session, and somebody might become really attached to the individual therapist and feel like they're willing to compromise boundaries or safety to maintain that relationship, even if on some level they're identifying that there is a misuse of power taking place. But in a broader context, let's say it's happening within a community. Sometimes we can be in certain communities for years, and making a decision if we're feeling violated to leave that community isn't just as easy as naming it and moving on. We are sacrificing relationships. We are sacrificing things that we've shared with other people that might make us feel vulnerable or unsafe to have that information travel beyond them. So this is a really complicated matter that if we're involved in communities, we need to consider, especially if we're a leader within those communities. That can cause a lot of pain and disconnection for people.
And I think especially in this community context, there's a lot of, if it's a community where people have a lot of interdependence, which again is not necessarily problematic. There's a lot of beautiful ways to make sure people have their needs met when we have those interdependent elements of community. However, taking into consideration, if someone were to no longer feel safe or have felt violated in community, would they be able to have access to their employment, to their housing, to basic needs, and also to their emotional needs? Will they still be able to have those relationships should they either name that they felt violated or end relationship to the community and living in the community? Would they still be able to have any access to the parts of their life that were really interdependent on being a part of that community? Our next question was, would there be a system of accountability for that person to report the hypothetical abuse? So, thankfully, there are some professions and some realms where there are clear pathways to accountability and places to report. Certainly, for someone who has it as part of their title, you may be able to go to, governing authorities like police, like a licensing board, like, where there is like some clear, you crossed a boundary. Now, if you are someone who maybe doesn't have formal boundaries, a code of ethics, a licensing board that kind of speaks for what your boundaries and ethics are, this can get a little bit more blurry. And then there is a question of, is there a system of accountability? And if there's not, then is there an opportunity for you to create one? or name that and say, if you ever felt uncomfortable, here's a pathway to a third party, a third party to where you can go and get some advocacy and have someone else hold space for you and address or intervene or assess if something needs to be reset, or honestly, just if this relationship needs to terminate, is there a third party where you can safely help make that happen? And then fourth question, what kind of boundaries are in place to respect autonomy and safety of the individuals who you hold spiritual power with? So, are there boundaries in place? Number one, have they been stated? I think two. And then, are folks free to have autonomy, to have a difference of opinion, to have a new perspective, or even like a combating perspective that isn't super, not even combating, but a different perspective than you? Is it safe for people to name that? Yeah.
If there aren't clear pathways to accountability, I think it's really important for you to identify what those are for you as a teacher, as a leader, and to clearly communicate that with your following, with your students, with your clientele.
And then the fifth question was just reflecting back. I think that this is an important piece of, perhaps prior to reflecting or taking inventory of spiritual power dynamics at play, are there any clientele, patients, congregants, folks who maybe you have had interactions with historically, that now taking inventory, you may have the opportunity to revisit those relationships and perhaps repair broken relationships if it's appropriate and safe for that person.
And finally, where does your spiritual support begin and end? We kind of discussed that already. So I think even having it be so clear as offering a handout to people, because sometimes when we say things, they can be misinterpreted or misremembered. So if we want to truly make ourselves and other people feel safe, I would say both have code of conduct, code of ethics, and clearly defining when spiritual support begins and ends can be really helpful for maintaining trust and consistency between you and whoever you're interacting with.
And I think there's a whole piece to that too for folks who have a less documented title or role, where that role really is open to kind of being created between multiple people. I think that it's important that when you're creating that role, that you name that, because what one person may perceive as the role of a pastor, or what does pastoral care include, someone else might feel like, well, that includes friendship. This is my pastor and he's my friend. In which I think it has to be clearly named that this is what you can expect me to show up for, and this is what you cannot expect me to show up for. And this is how I can help connect you to others who can show up for you in ways that I cannot.
With all of these inventory questions, we're going to move into some further considerations. And along the line of boundaries, as Kayla was just mentioning, it's important for you primarily first to understand what your boundaries are with your clients, followers, students. Because if you're unclear, then that's likely you're going to communicate that unclarity onward. So if you are open to having friendships outside of a class structure, outside of a ceremony structure with people, making that clear. If that's not an option, then that's not an option, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think with the boundaries consideration, if you don't already have a clear, code of ethics or code of conduct, I think it might be important to consider generating that. Generating what can folks who are interacting with you or coming to you for guidance, whether in a friendship or a more professional context, what can they expect from you? And at what point are you going to say, I don't have either it's the emotional labor, the emotional mental capacity right now to hold space for you, or is it that I actually, I think someone else needs to be doing that. That's not maybe an appropriate or healthy dynamic to engage in. To be able to know that for yourself, so that in those moments, if someone is requesting something of you, that quite honestly might be a threat to your safety and to your liability, right? I mean, no one feels good when anyone leaves an interaction feeling violated, whether it was your intention or not. That's really something I want to protect myself from, is also feeling like knowing that anyone felt violated or disrespected by me in an interaction where that's not my intent.
So, along these lines, something that I see in the spiritual new age energy world often is one individual trying to be everything to somebody's needs. And what that means is they are being a teacher, they are being a doctor, they are being a nutritionist, they are being a therapist. And it can feel really good for the ego to take on those identities and to feel like you have a lot of information to share, and that's valuable, but it's extraordinarily dangerous to take on roles that are not yours, because it just misinforms people, and it's just damaging and scary.
Are people informed of the dynamic that they're creating with you? Do they know what to expect? And so you have an opportunity to earn trust by setting boundaries, I think. So for me, when you start a relationship with someone in which you're holding any spiritual power or spiritual influence, I think it's important to set boundaries, because then you have an opportunity early on in the relationship to earn their trust by saying, I am predictable. This is what you can expect of me, and watch me right away show up to our sessions, to our interactions, to our ceremonies in this way, so that you know that I can stand by my boundaries and we can earn trust from folks in that way. So when talking about boundaries, I think we have to hold a very specific conversation around sexual and romantic connection and relationships. I think that this is something that there's not a ton of unity necessarily on across titles and roles in which there's a great deal of trust or spiritual power. I also think this is where we probably see the most disconnect showing up. I think the result of there not being a lot of unity or understanding or clear boundaries on when a romantic or sexual interaction is or is not invited or consensual in the context of a spiritual power dynamic is exactly a primary reason to why we need to hold space for a lot of folks who have left or found themselves in relationships, in power dynamics that felt extremely violating, manipulative, and abusive, often in a sexual or romantic outlet. That's kind of how it came to light. And so, certainly when it comes to folks with kind of a code of conduct or a code of ethics, often this is actually a piece of that. So for therapists, for example, we know that there is no such thing as a consensual sexual interaction or an affair per se between a therapist and a client, because that is a clear boundary in our code of ethics, that therapists cannot be engaging in sexual relationships with their clients. We know that the way that we define consent is that it's not even necessarily just like you want this or you don't want this. You feel comfortable or you don't feel comfortable. We know that there's other elements, for example, age. We know that there is an age dynamic at which point consent is not even an option. There is no such thing as consent between an 8-year-old and an adult. And I think that does come into play with spiritual power. I think there is spiritual power that can be such a wide kind of differential in that dynamic that consent isn't even actually possible or attainable. One relationship I want to just name where I think that my suspicion is really that there isn't ever a scenario in which consent would be attainable is in the clergy or pastoral care relationship. Of course, I'm speaking more specifically to religious trauma or spiritual abuse that occurs in religious contexts. I think that anyone who has a clergy or pastoral care, including like a youth pastor, pastoral care role, there is no, I'm really yet to hear any scenario in which that I think consent can be attained in those relationships, and because of the power dynamic being so, such a huge disparity of power in those contexts. So I think that no matter who you are and where you are, if you have folks coming to you for guidance, if you have folks coming to you to perhaps process their trauma, we know that those are relationships where there's going to be a super intimate bond, because trauma bonds and so does trust. And so particularly folks who've had any kind of trauma in their past, they might feel so safe, and they might have that very natural, organic, physical response to finally feeling safe in their bodies with a person. And if the very natural, organic elements of attraction come up, I think there's ways to explore that and address that without shaming either party, but also still holding to that clear boundary and repeating that boundary over and over. This is what you can expect from me. And I think that when there is that sexual or romantic dynamic added to that relationship where there's a spiritual power dynamic, I think that it's extremely dangerous for all parties. Number one, I think it's highly likely that someone may walk away from that feeling violated. And number two, I think for a person, as a person with power, that's not my intention or desire. I don't want someone to walk away from an interaction with me feeling manipulated. And so I think that also having a clear boundary of this is a demographic of folks I will not be engaging in romantic or sexual interaction with, and having it just be a clear-cut boundary also protects me. It protects my professional reputation, and it also protects me from inviting that type of yucky, horrible feeling of knowing someone that I care about and that I'm providing care to, walking away feeling abused, manipulated.
As Kayla mentioned, this has a little more clear-cut definition within more professional realms, but it's a very large gray area within spiritual communities, within yogic communities, and it's a danger for both parties involved, because we're in this environment where people are feeling safe, they are feeling vulnerable, and they're, as Kayla said, with this sense of trust, there is a huge bond there. So if you're also inviting in sexual energy, then if things go sour, which in our experience and the stories that we've heard, they inevitably do in these contexts, it's this untangling of spirituality from safety, from trust. And that's extremely confusing for people. And then it not only becomes hard for them to trust other people, but it becomes challenging for them just to have their own spiritual practice, because now it's been marred.
So conscious communication, I think, comes down to just like naming it. Are you talking about these dynamics with folks, with others? Are you naming when there's a power dynamic at play? Are you asking questions about, do you feel safe? Are you checking in on, are we creating this relationship together? Do you have any boundaries you'd like to bring into this relationship?
When we're exploring the dynamics of spiritual power, it's important to not make assumptions and not assume that somebody else understands what you mean or what your intent is. So being very clear internally about what the intent, why am I choosing to share what I'm sharing? Is it because I'm passionate and I found it to be helpful in my personal life? Or is it because on some level I am trying to manipulate this person into the way that I believe? So finding, why am I engaging? Why am I interacting in the way that I am?
I think it's important to hold intentional space to seek out others' boundaries and expectations and ask them, how do you define a sense of safety? What does your sense of safety feel like? And that way you're also helping to raise consciousness, hold space for them to raise consciousness around, if something doesn't feel right, I'm literally holding space for that to be named. That also allows the person with more spiritual power and influence in the dynamic to be able to be approachable and to say, I'm willing to hear you if you feel violated. Let's talk about it so that we can relieve this relationship of that sensation, because nobody wants there to be that sensation in the relationship. And also, I think that protects the person with that spiritual power too, because like I said, I think there's a lot of anxiety around accusation, right? And I think that these are also ways that you can hold space to make sure we're all defining the boundaries the same way, that we're all on the same page of what will and won't take place in this session, in this interaction, in this ceremony. It's surprises that leave people feeling like, whoa, I didn't even prepare a boundary because I did not think that was even on the table. I didn't expect this person to have a romantic or sexual interaction on the table, so I didn't even prepare to set a boundary with this person who I respect, who I see as a guru, as a guide, as a pastor.
One final thought about conscious communication is being very mindful about the type of language that we're using. There's this, I think, strong desire as a teacher, as a leader, to be the mouthpiece of God, to be the voice of the universe, to speak for a plant, whatever it might be, because that can make us feel important and powerful, which is what we're talking about. So using your language in such a way that doesn't elevate you above other people. It's a reminder that you are there to hold space, you are there to protect, you are there to uphold boundaries. You're not there to push any agenda, any behavior, any interaction on somebody else. So having your verbal expression match everything else.
And then a third piece is just, are there considerations for consent in your practice and in your work? In your relationships, are you naming, is there such thing as informed consent? Obviously, for me as a therapist, there is a very formal informed consent process. This is where I feel very protected, and I feel that my clients are very protected. I think I'm very lucky within this realm of people with spiritual power and influence that I have a more structured and documented kind of process to achieve that informed consent. But I think we all could create an informed consent process, especially when we're conscious of where that relationship might be starting with a power dynamic. We can say, hey, I just want to name, I think that you're coming to me seeking something. Can I make sure that you're seeking something that I can provide? And then, do you consent to this relationship that's going to look like these boundaries, this code of ethics, this is the expectations that I'm going to show up with, holding these values, holding space in this way. So kind of getting consent on the front end of the relationship when that's a possibility. And then also checking in on their sense of safety throughout the relationship. So as we know with consent, it's not just like a one-time means forever you're going to be cool with that, right? So being able to check in throughout the relationship, saying, does this feel safe? Does this feel okay for you? And kind of doing that pretty regularly and saying, do we need to shift this boundaries? Would you like to add an additional boundary? And again, making it clear that it's not just my boundaries. You're also inviting, do you have any boundaries that would make you feel safer in this relationship?
We're going to kind of close out by talking about access, which is a really big topic and could be a whole discussion in itself, but we feel like it's really important and we want to address it. So considering what communities have access to the type of work and the type of work that you're offering, what communities feel safe within your practices, and which communities are underrepresented. So this might be BIPOC, this might be queer, this might be disabled, this might be low income. And exploring how, if there is this misrepresentation or underrepresentation, how you can start to seek out consultation within these communities so that you might not be that person to hold space for people, but starting to navigate ways so that not just, you know, middle income and above, white bodied, straight, you know, whatever the normative identities are, those are not the only people that are receiving healing and spiritual services from us.
We hope that kind of some of these inventory questions, the reflective questions, and then also some of our just kind of considerations for safety that we've kind of received as part of the work that we've been doing for the last year. We hope that this is like helpful and conducive to you just kind of fine-tuning some of your work and your practice so that you can hold even safer space within your community and within all of your relationships.
Because ultimately, we're all vulnerable. We're all dealing with vulnerable people, and I don't think any of our intention is to ever exploit any of that vulnerability. But the reason that we're here is because it is happening, and it's sadly really prevalent within our community, because these are the stories that have been coming to us. So we come with love and with compassion and acknowledging our own blind spots and our own continued work and exploration as well. So thank you so much for showing up in that same way with us. We're going to finish off with a grounding exercise so we can leave together with this sort of intention, this seed planted in our heart of moving forward with more awareness. So coming to whatever position you feel comfortable, if it feels safe for you, letting your eyes close down and letting your awareness return back to the breath. Inviting your inhale to fill up your belly and let your exhale wash over the body, feeling the shoulders relax, feeling the belly relax. Feeling the jaw start to soften, releasing any clenching of fingers, toes. And taking these last few slow, deep breaths. And bringing your hands to rub together, creating some heat, some energy between the palms. Bringing the hands to rest over the eyes, very lightly, gently. And if the eyes are closed, you can let them blink back into the space, letting the hands rest back down. Thank you so much.